Good morning and welcome to the May 2024 board meeting of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, or MHRA as we prefer to call ourselves. My name is Graham Cook. I am interim co-chair of the MHRA alongside Mandy Calvert and Michael Whiteside, who are both here today. And my role is to lead us through the agenda. For those who've not attended board meetings before, I must start by reminding people that this is a board meeting held in public and is not a public meeting. And it's also important to explain that the board is responsible for agreeing the strategic direction of the agency, maintaining high standards of corporate governance and scrutinising the performance of the MHRA, but it's also important to clarify that this board does not make regulatory decisions on any medicine or medical device. This is because regulatory decisions on individual medical products are made by ministers in the Department of Health and Social Care on the recommendation of MHRA officials who are independent civil servants with the additional independent advice from our expert advisory committees, such as the Commission on Human Medicines. Now, as far as today's meeting is concerned, I need to make you aware that we'll be recording the meeting so we can publish the video on our websites as we have done previously, and to provide as many people the opportunity to observe what the board does here. On that note, I'm pleased to say that 84 people have registered to observe our meeting, with 49 members of the public or representatives of patient groups, 22 from industry and 11 members of staff. So thank you all for joining us. With introductions in mind, I'll go around the room to my left and start with June.
Good morning, I'm June Rain. I'm the CEO at the MHRA.
Good morning, Natalie Richards, Head of the Executive Office.
Good morning, Catherine Glover, Deputy Director, Medicines Regulation and Prescribing at the Department of Health and Social Care.
Good morning, Mick Floyd, Director of Delivery at the MHRA.
Good morning, Mercy Jessingham, Non-Executive Director.
Morning, Mandy Calvert, Interim Co-Chair.
Good morning, Hader Hussain, Non-Exec Director.
Good morning, Michael Whitehouse, Interim Co-Chair.
Good morning, Rose Braithwaite, Chief Finance Officer.
Good morning, Liz Booth, Chief People Officer.
Good morning, Nicola Rose, Interim Executive Director for Science and Research at the MHRA.
Good morning, Paul Goldsmith, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, Claire Harrison, Chief Digital and Technology Officer.
Good morning, I'm Glenn Wells, Chief Partnerships Officer at the MHRA.
Good morning, Alison Cave, Chief Safety Officer at the MHRA.
Hi, good morning, Junaid Bajwa, Non-Executive Director.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Bosworth, Director of Communications and Engagement.
Good morning, Carly McGarry, Director of Governance, MHRA.
Thank you all. So you should have access to the board pack, and I'll refer to the numbers in the board pack to keep us on track, and I expect that people have read the papers and we can spend our time on discussion. Although, as I say, this isn't a public meeting, we will provide an opportunity for members of the public who are listening to ask the board any questions about items on the agenda. And when we finished our board discussions this morning, we'll have time to answer those questions. However, please, for the members of the public, be aware that the board cannot see your comments in the chat function in the room here, as this is used by our communications and events team to identify questions for the Q&A at the end of the session. If you have a question that isn't related to the agenda on today, then please do not use the chat function, but contact the Customer Experience Centre, and those questions will be answered in due course. So similarly, please do not make any personal or abusive comments in the chat function. You won't get a response and you may be removed from the meeting. We don't tolerate any form of abuse or harassment towards our staff or board members by the individual members of the public. So with that in mind, we'll just go to the attendance today. There's a couple of apologies. Julian Beach, the Interim Executive Director, HQA, sends his apologies, and Raj Long won't be able to join us this morning due to personal circumstances. And I think then we have apologies from Alison Strath, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer from the Scottish Government, Cathy Harrison from Northern Ireland, and Greg Chalmers from the Scottish Government. Is there anyone else? I think everybody else is here, so it's nice to see everybody. In terms of conflicts of interest, we've got these in the papers. Is there any new or change to conflicts of interest people would like to declare? Junaid?
I just become a trustee for HDR UK, Health Data Research UK.
Good. That sounds good. Anything else? Okay, thank you. And then we'll just take the minutes of the last meeting, which we have here from March. I don't know if anybody has any comments or questions on those. If we're happy, we'll accept those as an accurate record of the meeting. There are a number of actions in those minutes. Action 114 we'll pick up on the agenda today, and the others are in the action log, which we'll deal with in due course. 2 have already been completed, 115 and 116. Great. Okay, so we'll accept those as a record. And before we come to June's report, I think it won't have escaped your attention what was happening yesterday. And, you know, I had the privilege, I guess, of being in the room yesterday when Sir Brian Langstaff was talking yesterday afternoon. And it was a very emotional experience, I think, for everybody there. The person on my left, I hadn't met before, had lost their partner 3 years ago, having just been diagnosed with hepatitis C, despite a blood transfusion 30 years ago. And I would recommend to everybody on the board, in fact, everybody in general, but certainly those who work in government, to watch that 40 minutes from Sir Brian. And I would really urge you, if you can, to read as much of the report as you can. You can't read it all, I don't think, but there's certainly the summary recommendations would be important to read. But June, can I pass to you for your comments?
Well, thank you, Chairman. As you quite rightly say, this is the issue that is at the forefront of all our minds today. And throughout the infected blood inquiry, we have been listening carefully to the enormously distressing experience of so many individuals and their families, and we offer our full and heartfelt sympathy to all of those who have suffered so much. We are absolutely determined to demonstrate that the healthcare products regulatory system has learned from these individuals and their wholly unacceptable experiences. The government will be studying the report and its recommendations in very great detail now, before returning to Parliament with a full and considered response. I think what we need to say today is that patients and families can have confidence in today's rigorous regulatory standards, and that the UK has one of the safest blood supply services in the world. Patient safety is our first priority, our highest priority. While no blood or blood product can ever be completely without risk, the stringent regulations that we have in place today are designed to prevent viruses being transmitted through blood or blood products. So the board, as you say, will be returning in the future to this issue.
Thank you. And as I say, I would recommend watching that if it's now available from yesterday afternoon. And there are many messages in there, but I think one of them is about speed. And so I think that we should bring something to our next public board as an agency response to some extent, that what we can do that's possible in that time. And so thank you. So we'll move to your report, if that's all right.
Yes, Chairman, it is a detailed report as usual, because it has been a very busy time, a very busy month working in our one agency configuration, and our overarching priority continues, as it has been since the start of the year, to eliminate backlogs of applications, to restore our activities to our statutory timelines, and deliver streamlined access to medicines and medical devices. I think as we're here at the Science Campus, it's important to say how the report shows the very impressive breadth of scientific activities which are undertaken here. And a particular highlight this month is the major grant for antimicrobial resistance research through the Global AMR Innovation Fund, which is called GAMRIF. And I expect that we'll want to explore in more detail how these research activities will help combat this major threat. We've also continued the important work on biological standards, reference materials that are the hallmark that distinguishes the work here. And it's good to highlight an international standard for an important arthritis medicine, golimumab, which has been achieved through intense collaboration with the European Directorate on the Quality of Medicines, which we call EDQM. I'd also like to highlight that the Stem Cell Bank has been thoroughly audited by the Human Tissue Authority and has passed really with only minor comment. Very successful audit. I've already highlighted on our access work the plan to eliminate the established medicines backlog, and it remains on track, having met the first target at eliminating down to 500 applications at the end of June, and we're now on at the end of March, and we're now on track for the end of June to eliminate the whole backlog. And I think that's a really important achievement by all the staff involved. What we are pleased to see too is the increasing uptake of our new data system, the Regulatory Connect system, especially Track My Case, Check My Data, over 2,500 of our industry stakeholders using that now to help manage their work. The international recognition procedure has now been in place since the beginning of the year. We've had about 60 applications, and of those, about 6 are for non-EU recognition. So it's something we're working on very hard to make sure that those decisions are suitably evidenced. And finally, I think we should return to delivering for patients and the public. We've looked at our patient involvement strategy carefully and determined that more needs to be done to provide feedback to those who've helped us and to demonstrate the impact of that feedback. So let's continue that work. And I'd also highlight, Chair, which will come to us, is the Whitehead report, which aims to ensure our regulatory regime has a basis in equity, particularly around medical devices. So it needs to be made more fit for purpose in that area. So all of this is achieved through the immense efforts of our staff. And I'd like to finish by highlighting the commitment to continuing to deliver for patients. Very happy to take questions.
Thank you. Huge amount of activity as always. Please, questions from the board. Don't be shy, or I'll have to ask about AMR.
Yes, it was more a comment than a question, really, and that was really around the cancer vaccines and things. And just to note, progress we're making in involving patients in that, and the comments that from people who experienced in other organisations as well, how much they appreciated how they were involved in it from the beginning. And I think that's kind of a key message we want, really, that patient involvement should be from the beginning. So just wanted to comment on that, June.
Well, thank you, Mercy. And I'm really glad you've picked up this really important area, which is going to look at various ways in which regulation will change. It will not be a product that we authorise. Likely it's a platform, ultimately. And patients need to be assured that every step of that new pathway, from the surgical treatment they may have through to getting the immunotherapy, has safety built in every step of the way. So we really welcome the involvement of patients, as I say, at an early stage, so that there's going to be confidence when a medicine is manufactured close to you, even at the bedside, that that assurance of safety is there.
Hader and then Mandy.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you, June. So much going on in that report, and just cherry picking a few things. Great to recertify under ISO 9001. Great progress around our AI strategy, and really good approval times for applications on CPRD. So lots to be really proud of. I suppose it's more of a comment than a question. I noted that the Treasury approved our business case for Regulatory Connect a few months into this financial year. And I was wondering if there was anything we could do to accelerate that for next year so that we continued the momentum and we didn't have any downtime, to use a tech phrase.
Thank you for highlighting that. And it's a big achievement getting the business case through, but it's just to maintain the momentum now. The system is at a critical stage. We know how welcome it is from the huge uplift in users and the positive feedback. But if we're to be as efficient as we aspire to be, this has to be a state-of-the-art system, and finishing the job is very much in mind. Chair, you might like to ask Mick Foy, who's Senior Responsible Officer for Regulatory Connect.
Mick?
Yes, so Treasury approved the full budget and the CDEL, the capital expenditure was also allocated by DHSC in full in time for the new financial year. So it didn't cross over years, which was good because we would have otherwise have had to be operating at risk. So with the Treasury approval for the funding, that's the full programme business case life, which crosses business years. But obviously next year's CDL funding will follow the usual process.
Do you want to follow up on that, Michael? Or okay, Mandy first, and then Michael.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Yeah, thank you very much, June, for giving a very comprehensive review. I was particularly struck by the science review, which I think really began to crystallise a little bit more our impact of how our science feeds through into our new regulations and how we regulate better going forward. And I think it would perhaps be at a later meeting is how could we understand a little bit better as a board how that scientific research flows through into improved regulation, which then impacts safety of patients. I thought the report was began to highlight that much better than perhaps we have in previous times. So thank you very much for the team. And I know Nicola's done a lot there. But I was wondering if it would be something we should discuss later as we're particularly in the light of the other discussion about the infected blood inquiry and how we join together much better.
Really welcome that question. Really welcome it because it comes into sharp focus, as you say, with the infected blood inquiry. We need the best science to make the best decisions. And where we are today builds on the work of our Chief Partnerships Officer before perhaps turning to science and research, particularly engaging the CERSIs, the Centres of Excellence of Regulatory Science and Innovation, so that it doesn't always have to land here, but can be a coordinated effort throughout the UK. But perhaps first, Nicola would like to say more about some of the elements undertaken here that really support robust decisions.
Yes, thank you, June. So it's a really good point, Amanda, and thank you for raising that. A lot of the work that we do on the South Mims campus is very much regulatory focused, and it is trying to help innovators and for existing products think, how do we make our products regulatory ready? How do we make sure that our products are going to be well standardized, that they are going to work the same each time for like diagnostics? How can we improve treatment decisions? So I think it's a really positive thing that you've picked up there. And in fact, if I may, Chair, pick up on the AMR, one of the elements of that is very much to look at what is the innovation space there and how can we support that through thinking what biological reference materials might we need to make and what kind of regulatory processes can we then develop to support those.
Thank you. Should we go to Glenn for comment?
Sure. As June's already touched on the Centre of Excellence of Regulatory Science Innovation, we've been working alongside the Office of Life Sciences and Innovate UK so we can get reach into the UK R&I system. We're at the shortlisted stage now where colleagues around the table here are engaging and the teams are engaging with those potential CERSIs. That competition closes later in the summer and then we'll make a decision about funding to pump prime those and then look to see how we support and work with them over a longer period of time. I hope they become a critical mass of expertise for us to draw on.
Great, and we'll talk a bit more about that in the context of data as well, I think. Michael, did you have a question?
Yeah, the separate question. As ever, June, the paper is very comprehensive. My question related to benefit risk evaluation, paragraph 3.5. Impressed by the work that's been done in responding to issues of concern raised with medical devices or medicines. I return to a question I think I've asked before is, are we confident that where it's practicable, we give feedback to people who've raised issues around concern with medicines or medical devices? I appreciate this is difficult. It's probably for Alison, but if you could give us a little bit more what our policy is, because it relates to speed and response times, I think.
to welcome that question. The basic report from an individual has a much more interactive element to it now. I think when there's a major or thorough safety review, our comms colleagues support the leadership in safety and surveillance to ensure there's broader feedback. But I've absolutely no doubt that both Chief Safety Officer and our Director of Communications will say we're on a journey here and we can do a lot better. But over to Alison.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Incredibly important to feedback. So I think we do have a number of routes to feedback, and it depends on the scale and depth of the review. So for really significant reviews, we look to do a public assessment report, and we've done a number of those over the last years and are looking at how we can increase the frequency of those. We also, of course, communicate through our drug safety update bulletin, which has specific advice for patients as well as healthcare professionals about the introduction of new risk minimization measures. So we also do, of course, press releases in order to communicate changes. Companies go directly to healthcare professionals through specific letters. For very big issues, we have put up a web pages in the past. So there's a number of routes we can communicate, but as June says, we're always looking at how we can improve that communication. It is incredibly important to feedback to people when they've taken the time to talk to us about an issue.
Yeah, and not least because it encourages more people to do the same.
Absolutely.
Rachel.
Yeah, just to add that feedback to patients who have contributed to reviews is something that's very much in our minds at the moment, and it is one of the early findings of the patient involvement evaluation, which we'll be bringing to the public board in July.
Mercy, I don't know if you want to comment now or if for another time.
I was going to save myself for my report, really, because we have obviously discussed this. So yes, I'll talk a little bit more about it then.
Great. Maybe if I could ask one question then. You talk in the 7.3, you talk about a core performance script that's gone out to key stakeholders that's well received. It would just be helpful to hear a bit more about that. I don't know that I've seen it. It might be something that the board would be interested to see. Could someone comment on what that is?
Yes, certainly. And I think Rachel come into, it may have come with all the dense amount of information. We definitely want to be much more transparent about all aspects of performance. And while top of the list has been established medicines and clearly clinical trials, we're building out from there. So our monthly report has been supplemented by a much wider narrative. It can go a lot further, and we've got some plans to launch quite a comprehensive story and resume across all our key performance indicators. But Rachel give the latest timing on that. But you should have seen the first one in all the paperwork.
Yes, certainly. The first one was circulated probably about 3 weeks ago now, so board members will have received that, but I appreciate there's a large volume of material that comes through to you. That will be updated during the rest of this week, so there'll be an updated version coming out very shortly. And then I'm expecting that we move to the more comprehensive performance data publication in the next 2 to 3 months, which will be that more comprehensive overview of all KPIs. And we're working very closely with Rose and her team to make that happen.
Great. Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, no, if not, well, thank you. It's yeah, always impressive to see all this activity as always. I think we'll move on now then, if that's all right, to the performance report. So Rose, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. So the report tabled shows the agency's performance for the final quarter of 23-24 and a summary of our business plan delivery for the full year. So out of the 44 objectives, we've completed 27 with plans to complete a further 10 within the first quarter of this financial year. And the final 7 all have mitigation plans in place for their delivery as well. In terms of the KPIs, we've done a more condensed pack, but with more information in it. And I think in particular, you'll welcome the fact that we are starting to flag volumes so that we can have early indicators where we may have any issues in the future. But open to any questions.
Please, comments or questions? Yeah, Michael.
Congratulations to Rose. I think this is a really comprehensive report. Inevitably, when you get to the end of the financial year, you reflect back, and yeah, we've met a significant number of objectives, but a number have been delayed. What lesson do we take from that? Is there a degree of optimism bias? Are we trying to do too much? Are we under-resourced? What does the executive team take from this as a key lesson?
And I might add as an addendum before you answer, that I think there was a comment in the CEO report that said inevitably some of these items have slipped. And I was surprised inevitably was left in. So why is it inevitable? And can we prevent that?
I think there was some optimism bias. I think we've learnt from that. If we think about how we focus the current year's business plan far more on focusing on our core deliverables and making sure that we deliver those. So the return to green work and the performance of our core statutory functions. So I think we've taken those lessons and have really focused this current year's business plan far more. I don't know if June wanted to say more on that.
This year, we're relentlessly focusing on volume predictions and where the staff are most needed to be increased or indeed pulled back. And I think that we have a much better grip, as Rose has said, on what that should look like. Always bear in mind that there are some unpredictable resource consuming efforts, and I wouldn't like to try and give an exhaustive list, but teams have spent a lot of time, for example, on the COVID inquiry, Windsor framework, things that have to be dealt with, and we are more than able to welcome and deliver on those. So while we focus, as I say, relentlessly on our core deliverables, as part of the wider DHSC, there are areas where we must deliver on as well. So if it'd be good to have the element of hindsight, we should go back and look at exactly how we've managed to make those prioritization judgments throughout the year and get better at it.
Anybody else wish to comment in response to Michael's question? Manny.
Yeah, I would echo what Michael said. I think this is a significant improvement on what we've seen in terms of volume. There's a little bit, if only we'd had this when we were doing transformation. I think there's a clear point around understanding. It would be good to understand what lessons have been learned. I think it would also be good to understand what where external factors have tripped things up or wherever, so that we can understand what resilience we need in the organisation going forward. And I would also like to understand how this work is feeding into the workforce planning, as we had the discussion last time around when we discussed the risk register, that resources was still an underlying tension, really, and getting that in the right place. So I'd like to understand how that is going to relate to the workforce plan going forward.
I might ask Liz if you want to comment on that.
Simply to agree with that, I think it absolutely must be integral to the strategic workforce plan and to some extent to our operational plans as we plan for single years, and certainly is part of the thinking.
And when will we get some visibility of that?
I think perhaps first visibility in the next couple of months, I think. But I to do a really thorough strategic workforce plan will take us a bit of time, will take this whole board a bit of time. So I hope you'll bear with me if we look at it in a few stages rather than ask me to produce it and go ta-da, because I think I'll need the expertise of people around this table to feed into that, particularly around demand modelling.
Okay, well, I think we will try and get that on the agenda this side of summer, certainly, so no later than July, I think, probably, if that sounds reasonable. I mean, not expecting a full That's a full plan, obviously. Saw a hand and then I lost it. So can I just get a general sense from the room about the metrics we've got here and whether we think these are the things that the board needs to have a sense of what's going on with the organisation and performance? I'm seeing mostly nods in that respect. I don't know if anybody wants, so that's, I think, helpful. And I don't know if anybody wants to pick into any particular KPI about where we are in terms of resource and progress. I mean, there are one or two that are going the wrong way.
It's not a on the individual indicators, because I can come back to that. I just make one system point. So a number of us sit on boards within the NHS, and I think the NHS is better at monitoring performance going forward. So what I've seen with these types of reports is where there's a negative variance, you get a commentary that would say the variance is within accepted parameters. So we don't have a systemic issue with the system. What it will indicate, though, also where the trajectory is suggesting that there is a systemic problem and that the system, that the trajectory will be not brought back on target without some remedial action to the system. And I think we need to get to this stage in this type of report, because it would address Mandy's point that if we see something that's going offline, it would, you know, I'm not too worried if it's a minor blip, but I am worried if there is a real system problem. And I think that's where we didn't get it right, to be frank, earlier in the year. So you know, there are people who are more expert than me in this, and I think we could draw on that in the next stage of development. It's not to say this isn't brilliant, but I'm just looking forward how we could take it to the next level.
And I guess there is some insight attached to the KPIs, which maybe you're suggesting could be developed. But,
yeah.
And Rose, I don't want to put this all on you. Clearly, this is a shared endeavour. But do you want to just comment on?
Yes, of course. No, thank you for that insight, Michael. I think the volumes is starting to do that process,
Yeah,
but I agree.
Yeah.
It's difficult to do that forward view to estimate how things are going to progress, because we are demand led, which makes it a bit more tricky. But I agree, we need to think about how we do that. But I think the volume section, which is new, should start showing that pattern. And obviously we have some which are in the deep red already. So we should hopefully see that trajectory improve in that volume section. But you're right, we need to think about where we've got green, how that volume section can help us view whether we are likely to go into the red in the future. So I'll take that away and have a think with the team about how we might progress it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think the sense is very much this is really good progress, and then, you know, how much further can it go? June, do you?
I think it's also worth bearing in mind with the Return to Green initiative, and that's because it's a sort of fairly, you know, the high priority areas, that the ways to take remedial action on a system are very much front of mind. And the clinical trials was obviously to move to a notification system. There'll be other ways to introduce quite a substantial change that rectifies and does so sustainably. So I'm very much looking to make sure that for all those lines in our Return to Green, there is an intervention or a remedial action that we know will work and continue to.
Sinead.
Just to maybe double click on the point that we made earlier, I think there is a dependency on the workforce plan as we think about this. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. So we could measure everything, but we'll still have a resourcing issue. And so we really need to think about the two in tandem. So I do think there might be a degree of prioritization as we think about the workforce plan and how we bring that to the fore, because I think there's a leading indicator on that to say, actually, how will we ever do our work if we don't have our workforce and our people in place? And so we'll continually have these circular conversations until we take some action in that place. So I do think that we should prioritize the workforce plan to then support the measures that we put in place.
Would your thought be that we should have something further in the KPIs around workforce? And
before we do that, I just wonder whether we need to support the work being done to do the plan in the first place, and then use that to then inform what we think about in terms of the KPIs.
Yeah, Liz, I mean, I think we've sort of touched on it already, but do you want to comment at all?
again, I'd simply comment by agreeing with that. I think absolutely every aspect of our work, the innovative work, and also the routine work is dependent on our colleagues, and we have particularly training lead times that we need to be able to cope with. So we don't have a huge availability of people off the shelf, as it were, very often. So workforce planning at the strategic level is perhaps more important in this organisation than in others.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Mick, yeah.
We mentioned the Return to Green programme and some of the sort of interaction between the KPIs and future performance. We're currently going through a root cause analysis.
So my acronym nudge has just happened. I started it, you followed. KPI.
Key performance indicators. So we're doing a root cause analysis of where we fell behind on achieving some of those targets, and some of the themes coming out of there are not just workforce, but also business process, the IT, the data available in order to understand what we're doing. So that, I think that's a critical part of the process, is to understand where interventions are required. And that then leads to helping with the workforce planning. If you sorted out your business process, if the IT is going to fix some issues, if you've got the right data to hand, will that address some of the problem? And is it still resource and skills mix?
Thank you. Michael, did you have a hand?
Yeah.
This is an important area of work. Can we say a little bit more about some of the indicators that are red? So manufacturing distribution authorizations, still 47% completed on time. And then we've also got scientific advice. I know the trajectory is to sort all this out but are we really confident about that? Because these figures are still quite low.
Who'd like to pick that up? I'm going to look at you first, Mick. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Mick, I was looking at you. I do.
So the inspections work area in Return to Green covers the manufacturers and distribution licenses where the KPIs are below. We are still in the infancy in really addressing that one. There are resource constraints on inspections. They don't all require a physical inspection. So there's a process that we are going through. The clearance date for the backlog is at the moment December, but we're challenging that, and the root cause analysis work is going to be key to understanding where the blockers are in there. But physical inspections are an area where throwing more resource at it is not easy because of the skills of an inspector that take a long time to be trained. So do we need to do a physical inspection always? Can we do it a little bit differently? Those are the conversations that we're having. On the scientific advice piece, there's a number of different types of scientific advice that cut across the agency, and largely the people that provide the scientific advice are the same resources that are heavily committed towards clearing the backlogs for established medicines, innovative medicines, making sure that we stay on track with clinical trials. So scientific advice has taken a bit of a back seat whilst the focus has been on those areas. What we're looking to do, and we've been speaking, colleagues have been speaking with an external expert in this area, is our model for scientific advice. Can we do it differently? Because sometimes there's a whole collection of people across different business areas in the agency that need to be brought together to bring that scientific advice package together. Is that the right model? That's what we're looking at, and if we can bring in a new model, will that help in bringing down the backlog of scientific advice meetings that are outstanding?
So I guess sorry, Michael, go ahead.
what I read from this, Nick, and again, it's not good. There's a lot to do. And what concerns me is the level of resource investment in this. And the second question I struggle with over and over again is, how is this all integrated? Does this come under, who is the single point that brings all this together? Is it you? Is it Turn to Green? Is it, what is the governance around that? Because you're having to make trade-offs. And these trade-offs are quite complicated, I think, in terms of priorities.
Nick, do you want to comment? I mean, Return to Green, is this the coordination function for this?
It is, but there's a governance process around Return to Green. There's a program board that meets on a weekly basis. We report into Exco on a weekly basis, and just a week and a half ago, we reported into ODRC, the Organisational Development Remuneration Committee, which is the route into board governance. So the governance is there. Obviously, Return to Green is focused initially on backlog clearance, but step 2 of that is sustainability of that backlog clearance to make sure that we're kind of fit for the future, and that goes to business process, resource, technology, etc., etc. So I'm confident that we've got the right governance in place, the right reporting lines. We put the right wrapper around Return to Green as a program, but there are challenges with resource in tackling the immediate issue of backlogs and trying to use the same experts' time in workshopping, root cause analysis, etc., for that future fit piece.
Okay. So, I mean, in terms of your general question, Michael, then I guess in that specific example, there is some narrative there that says when things should be back on track. And I guess generally that should be part of all these KPIs is what is the expected time to recover or not.
Yeah, and trying to be constructive, and I generally am trying to do this. I've seen in other organisations that, you know, you've got something like December 24, and before you know it, December is there, and we find we haven't met the target. So it's the question mark is the actions that we are taking now, quite obviously, will influence our capability to do that. And I have some sympathy for the executive team in that you're having to make some very difficult trade-offs. If you put more resource in now to meet the target on the 24th, whenever it is in December, does that mean that the redesign work to make us resilient is lost? And that's where I'm still struggling to understand whether we've got that trade-off right. And obviously we have to trust you, Mick, in what you're doing, but we also want to support you. And I think this is a really difficult issue. And I think it's one of the real big risks that the board faces if this organisation is going to be resilient going forward.
Does anyone else want to comment on that particular issue?
I would support Michael in that. I think this is the first time we've seen some of the other backlogs in terms like inspections, distribution, scientific advice. I think we really need to understand that backing to the resourcing might need a different baseline from where we've been working, because we're uncovering that, and I think that's all credit to the team of doing that. But I think, are we doing enough to put that resilience in place and to make those dates? And I think that's what the board needs assurance on, because the workforce plan is obviously behind, following on and working on that. But are there things that we can do? Things like scientific advice are probably one of the key things to making us a regulator where innovators are going to come to the UK. So it's very important in that, although it's not a statutory function. But I think we need to think about that, and I think we haven't seen what would be needed to build that resilience in, and I think that would be very valuable.
I just want to confirm that the executive absolutely get it and understand this. There is work being done to look at a new model for scientific advice, and I'd like to propose, Chair, to bring a paper back on that.
Yeah.
Because it's time we shook it out and looked at what will work for the future. It is recognised to be, if you like, potentially a jewel in the crown if we can get it right, and it's essential that we do that now. the urgency of these issues that we've spoken about, including the manufacturing licenses, is fully recognised. And as far as I remember, on the manufacturing licence applications, it's going upwards rather quickly. And I think the last I saw was more in the 60%-ish. And I think we'll see that. The board has agreed the compliance strategy, you'll recall, for inspection. And that's being wrestled with to ensure that this is dealt with sustainably.
Thank you. Liz has a hand. I might ask Nicola afterwards if she wants to comment on the link between scientific strategy and scientific advice. But yeah, Liz.
I was just going to comment on workforce planning again. It's a bit of a theme this morning, isn't it? Notwithstanding my huge desire to get a strategic workforce plan in place. Operationally, areas, and our inspectorate is a particular one, have some workforce challenges. And I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that we are simply awaiting a strategic workforce plan. We are working with colleagues to look at the challenges of that particular workforce, which is an extremely high skill workforce that has rightly a fairly substantial training period. So looking at both the employment proposition and of course the training and development and numbers, and I wouldn't want to leave you with the impression that piece of work is not being done. It most certainly is, in collaboration, of course, with Return to Green.
Thank you. Just, do you want to comment briefly about the scientific advice and how that relates to what you're thinking about at the moment, Nicola?
Yes, thanks, Chair. So from that point of view, the Science Campus, we have a very broad expertise scientifically across different biological medicines. And certainly over a number of years, we've been available for informal scientific advice, and certainly for the agency as a whole, we can apply that to more formal settings for regulatory meetings, but also that we can have people approach us individually. So we hope to support much broader across the regulatory space as well.
Thank you. Maybe last comment, Glenn. I think you had a hand.
Some of the points we've made, it was just to push back on the premature bringing forward a paper to the board on workforce planning. I think we've just heard that there is an enormous amount of work. As Jean said, wrestling is a good word, actually, wrestling with the challenges we have on what we're trying to do to redesign not only from grassroots how we deliver our services, but how we resource them. I'm just concerned that if we press the button for a paper in July, that's less than 6 weeks to get ready we won't have a workforce plan that's credible to come to. I think we should.
So I don't think anyone's suggesting that we have the workforce plan for July.
No, I'd agree with that, because I think if there's a plan to develop the strategy, I agree. I just think it is at this point where we're doing
that was the discussion. Yeah. Good. All right. I think we'll draw that to a close. But thank you, Rose. I think. Oh, don't know what that was. I mean, I think I've heard good support for what you've shown us in terms of the presentation. I think it's very helpful for us to be able to see that, and it's useful for us to be able to support the areas where we think more work is required. I think you've heard some sort of evolutions that might help sort of provide that assurance for the board, but then also we've recognised the complexity of trying to get this through at the moment. So, support the exec in trying to integrate this as best we can in terms of the priorities going forward, but with some clear sights as to when we want this all to be green. Good. So thank you. My mic's gone off. Julian, I don't know who's going to talk to this in Julian's absence. So Mick, okay. Thanks, Mick. Over to you.
Yeah, so Julian's on annual leave. I think we've actually started to go into this subject area. As we've explained, the clearance of the established medicines backlog is amongst the highest priority work areas for the agency. We have a plan, and significant progress is being made against that plan. As June mentioned in her report, the next milestone there is getting to 500 by the end of June. Backlog clearance is dependent on a number of things. Industry responding to the requests for information that have been sent out. And there's a lot of conversation with industry, good engagement, but it's also dependent on our ability to send enough RFIs out to industry to respond to. So if you imagine the work process as a hopper, we've got applications coming in, we've got to assess them, send a request for information out, and wait for that information to come back so we can clear the assessment. So we've got to do the first bit of work and rely on the industry to respond to those requests for more information, more clarification. So that's part of the new process that was introduced in March, and that process has been implemented and is bearing fruit. So just to put some more colour on that, the amount of assessment that we've asked assessors to do in terms of assessment report writing has been reduced to free up more time on the physical assessment. We're doing one RFI only now, whereas it used to sometimes go through multiple rounds of RFI. So that one RFI has got a time-bound response target to it as well, which if the response does not come in, we are minded to refuse that application. So these are kind of the big ticket interventions that have been made in the business process. That took a lot of engagement with the industry. They've signed up to those new business processes, and where we've been taking those cases to the Committee on Human Medicines for refusal, we've seen 100% concordance with MHRA recommendations. So that newly introduced business process from March is bearing fruit. We're also reliant on people, and we've been recruiting heavily since the back end of last year, but that's been possibly slower than we'd hoped, bringing in additional resource, and that additional resource requires training. So we now have what we call an evergreen recruitment campaign, which is permanently open for pharmaceutical assessor resource. We're also using external service providers and contractors to target in on those first assessments. Retention and change management are issues that are also being tackled on the people front. I mentioned the engagement with the pharmaceutical industry. There are regular meetings with trade associations, particularly the Generics Manufacturers Association, where there are bi-weekly meetings, and we've held webinars on the new process with a focus in there on getting that engagement in responding to the requests for information that are going out. Those are I think the key messages. We're on target. There are risks associated with that in terms of being able to feed that business process, but the end of June date for that 500 target is on track.
Thanks. And before we open up, I mean, I guess there are potentially lots of the questions we've just been talking about, the broader questions that maybe we can talk about, but specifically in relation to this piece, is there anything people want to ask and clarify? And can you just remind us the targets that you think you can achieve? Mix of 500, is the 500 remaining in June?
Yeah.
And the elimination of the backlog is aimed at?
It's currently aimed at the end of September, but that is reliant on all of those factors.
So what level of confidence do you have around that, would you say, roughly?
I would say mid to fair in if we get the contractors on board to do the assessments that we're asking them to do. There's still outstanding work to be done to get the signatures on the contracts, bringing in those additional resources to feed the system so that the assessment teams can clear the responses. So feeding that machine is critical to being able to clear them out in the timelines. We're also looking at having a from July date of being assured of compliance for new applications coming in, because that system has been tightened up.
And would you say you have a time in mind where you would have a high confidence of having cleared?
Back end of the summer, well, back end of July. I think we'll have a very clear picture as to
Okay,
if
I thought you said
those,
okay.
if those contractors have come in up to speed, delivering, feeding the machine as we expect them to.
Questions for others? Michael, quick on the trigger.
Sorry. Mick, I think you're doing a brilliant job. So please take my questions, hopefully in a constructive way. I'm interested in how you get to a degree of confidence. So for me at this point in time, if I'm looking to increase my workforce to deliver the volume that you're having to do, how many people have been given job offers? You know, when are they likely to start? How many people, contracts have been signed? You know, it's that sort of thing that would say to me, I'm confident about the resourcing because this is all in place. You'll know this from your industry experience. Can you just give a little bit of flavour of that, please?
Well, Liz may want to talk about some of the recruitment. I don't know the numbers of additional resources that have been brought into HQ&A, but there's been a trickle, let's say, over the past few months of new pharmaceutical assessors coming in. We've called upon some ex-staff to come in because of their experience. So we've been topping up some of these were to fill vacancies, and then we're going a little bit over as well. The external resources to come in, contractor service providers will do a number of assessments for the contracted money to put those first assessments out.
So do you have within the organisation what I would call a staff allocation system whereby you can see 2 months, 3 months, 6 months ahead what staff are going to be deployed on, where they're being deployed, and the potential to redeploy them if you need to? See, I think this is more important than workforce planning, to be frank. You need a system like that in place.
I don't think I can answer that directly, but what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks is looking at the time that we sent the request for information out, when we would expect that to come in, and we can see the peaks and troughs.
That's your demand.
That demand. So in some weeks we can see that there are 9 things that are going to be in, and other weeks there's 23. So we're trying to look at what staff are on holiday, how do we cope with that? So because some are coming, half-term week, etc., looking at the resources available to us for the incoming volumes of work expected that week is kind of how we're approaching this particular area. Also, these staff are looking at variations and other things. Scientific advice is something they've had to park because of this as an example. So that kind of workforce juggling has been key to getting down on plan where we are today. We're getting a lot more granular now as we move into that critical period on doing that week by week view of what we expect to come back from the request for information, what in the backlog is at risk of going over that 210 days, because there's lots of applications still in there around 190 days, 200 days, and we can see where they're coming. So trying to juggle all of that is how we're getting assurance on our ability to meet the model. That's probably not answered your question, but that's what we
look. I'm not, and I've got sympathy. It seems to me that there are some system issues here that haven't been resolved about staff allocation, resource, because ultimately we're a service delivery organisation, and at the core you need a staff allocation. But Liz, you can probably tell me we've got that.
I can give you a partial answer. I'm afraid. I think the key questions you're asking are around the flexibility of our workforce. Can we easily move people around because they are multi-skilled, and also our ability to create some surge resource when we're in a situation as we are, when we've got more work than not. I think the partial answer is it's limited at the moment. We've not set ourselves up to in that way, and I'm going to say it again. One of the reasons I'm so keen on strategic workforce planning is one of the things it does is allows us to do that. In terms of the numbers around established medicines, we've put a lot of effort into recruiting people that have got a great deal of experience in established medicines regulation. So essentially people who've worked in our industry, either in our organisation or related organisations in the past. But we've also now, as Mick said, using an evergreen campaign, gone out for a new cohort of pharmaceutical assessors who we're going to train as a cohort. And I think it's important to say that. We've had some very great success. So we've got 6 new colleagues. I believe the calibre is very high. 6 new colleagues starting with us. We are projecting at the moment the 1st of July, so that they start together. Some may start a bit before, but they'll train together. And the reason that this cohorted approach, I think, is one that will help us is as we train them, we can train them in live work, and the processes that Mick's developing. You know, we will look out for the things that we can focus the cohort of new trainees on that obviously lead to their accreditation too, but will give us some more active capacity. Could we recruit more? I think in the current climate, I think we could go for a second cohort if we thought that was right, but we do need to understand how incredibly expensive it is to train people, and to make sure that we're matching our long-term resources with the long-term demand. And on that point, I'd say that we are projecting the need for more biological assessors coming up as an organisation. So we're also out to recruit a cohort of biological assessors, and that is hopefully to meet need that is not yet in the system, but thinking about how as applications of this type come into the organisation, we'll have the staff ready. So there's quite a bit of what I call the operational workforce planning going on. But in the real answer to your question, do we have the flexibility and surge resource that we need to run this as a business? We're still working on that. And
Michael,
shut up. But then obviously my one final question is, it's not that I'm really just looking for a common system that would help you do this in a more effective way. And I appreciate you're relatively new to the organisation, but it seems to me that's got to be the way in which we get out of this. But thank you both.
Can I just clarify? So that's really helpful. I mean, in terms of the numbers you're talking about, you mentioned 6. Can you just give a sense of what that means in proportion to what you have already? What sort of change are we looking at in terms of assessor numbers for this area?
Oh gosh, you're
Just
challenging
roughly.
my memory for the numbers of pharmaceutical assessors. I think it's late 40s, early 50s in total.
Okay, so 10-15%-ish.
So Mick, does that sound about right to you? Sorry,
Yeah, I think that's in the right ballpark.
Okay, so there's
for pharmaceuticals.
that's
I'll check the exact number and
And then it
send
sounds
to the
like I'm
board
just
on-
trying to sort of understand where we are with this. There's sort of a slightly different emphasis from workforce planning within terms of the workforce allocation and that piece of work, which I guess is relevant now regardless of what the workforce is. So at some point when you think about how to take that forward and whether that's going to be something to prioritise or not, or is that something already in your thinking about how that's done?
It's in my thinking about our planning generally, but obviously always very keen to seek the views and advice of the board. And you know, this is a specialist workforce, and we need to treat it as such. So very happy to discuss it further, or indeed to I'm always would like to seek wise counsel about how to do this as well as we can do it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's certainly something that might be helpful to come back with at the right moment. Great. Any final comments or questions on this? I mean, I think otherwise, thank you, Mick, and thank you for the work that's being done. I think it's good to see the trajectory of this. I hope you have the support you need. I hope you get everything you need to do that, and let us know if you think there's other things. Good. I think we have a guest for the next one. Is that right? Who's presenting the next paper? So this is about criminal enforcement unit's approach to identification, prioritization, reduction of the threat posed by the legal trade in human medicines. And Alison, I think your name's against it.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And we offered this paper to the board. It sets out our view of the current threat to the UK public from the illegal supply and sale of medicines, sets out how we identify, how we assess and manage those threats, as well as how we measure the impact of our criminal enforcement unit. Our legitimate supply chain remains secure in the UK. So as set out in the paper, we consider the major threat to the public is presented by the illegal trade of medicines online, and which is very challenging to tackle. I welcome Andy Morling, Deputy Director of the Criminal Enforcement Unit, who's going to present the paper, provide any further reflections, and we welcome future discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. And Andy, you can assume people have read it, but please tell us what the key points that you'd like us to think about.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction, Alison. Yes, morning, everybody. So in the paper, as Alison said, I tried to set out our current understanding of the threat, which is quite sophisticated. I'm pleased to say we have a very well-resourced intelligence function. So we collect intelligence from multiple sources. So we have a fairly refined understanding of where things are. And I'm delighted to say that unlike many forms of crime, it's quite a stable picture that we see. We don't see massive movement within the threat. And the second part, as Alison said, is what we do about that threat. How we respond to the level of threat that we see across the landscape. This is increasingly an imported threat. Online is the new front line, as I often wittily say. And so our response is equally in that way. We have to reach out overseas. We have to work hard to tackle the threat in an online sense, because that's where it manifests itself. And we take the sort of enforcement action that you'd expect us to take. So arresting and prosecuting people for offences. And then the final piece, which is always alluded, or the final part of the paper, which has always eluded my law enforcement professional colleagues, is how to measure the success of the work that we do. We don't have an accurate measure. I'll put my hands up to that, because in reality, we don't know how much crime is out there to the degree that we can measure other things. So therefore, we have to use a proxy measure. So what we currently use, and I think I detail that in some at some length in the paper, is how we assess the impact we have using professional judgment and an independent panel to look at the impact we're having and use that as a proxy for the outcome that the public faces, the public enjoys, if you like, from our effort. And of course, it's a cycle. So the effect of that activity is it reduces the threat. So when we come to assess the threat again the following year, we expect to see reduction in the overall threat. I have to be honest, we're not seeing that at the moment. We're seeing a very static threat picture, despite our efforts to up our game in terms of our response to it. So happy to have any questions. Delighted to be here today, and that's all I've got left to say for the moment.
Thank you. It was a very clear paper, but questions or comments, Paul?
No, thank you. It's sort of very interesting paper. I mean, most of the discussion is sort of upstream of prescription. Do you have any sense for how much diversion occurs post-prescription?
Sorry, so this is diversion from
patients selling on the medications
that
are prescribed to them, or sharing medications.
There's little intelligence that suggests that's an issue. It is, as you know, in certain situations, an offence in itself, but that's something we certainly don't see. What we do see is diversion from within the regulated supply chain. We see UK stock being diverted at pharmacy level and at wholesaler level. With members of the public post-prescription, no, we don't see that very regularly at all.
Because anecdotally, I hear a lot of it with patients picking up their gabapentin and then selling it in the car park immediately outside of their pharmacy. So I'm surprised.
Can I clarify that's the role of the agency to scrutinise and enforce?
Well, no, I don't, because that was sort of a related question actually, in terms of just the public health approach to what are the underlying drivers for why patients are seeking these sort of illicit supplies, whether it's from other patients or from the online services, and is anybody taking a public health approach to this?
Sure, and actually I can probably add a bit more to your previous question as well before I answer that. So the street dealing, if you like, of prescription medicines in the way you described yes, anecdotally, intelligence doesn't tell us that this is an issue. What we'd probably find is if it were happening, and if there was interdictions taking place, it would be the police service that would do it rather than ourselves, because it'd be happening in a sort of inland space. But technically, yes, in some situations that's a human medicines regulations offence. So we would be on point for it, but in reality, the police would probably deal with it in practical terms because they'd be the ones that would see it. Don't think it could be done at the scale that would enable us to get out of bed for that sort of offending. To be honest, it would be relatively small scale, I would suggest. Your second question is a really important one. What drives people to this trade? This is very much a demand-led form of crime. Others tend to be very much supply-led, so it's criminals looking to do their deeds. But here, it's very much driven by the demand. We don't know is the short answer. It's a very complicated picture. There are, of course, the usual substance abusers, misusers of narcotics that are drifting into controlled drug medicines. So that's a part of the population, relatively small part, I think. Then there are those that think it's a legitimate thing to do. They think that's the way one can access medicines quite legitimately, and therefore they perhaps don't realise that they are feeding an illegal trade. So they're doing it in all innocence. And there are those that take a choice, which is probably the bulk. Those that will say, do you know what, I could get these through a legitimate route. I could get these through my healthcare practitioner, but I'm going to go the shortcut route. And that could be for reasons of anonymity, perhaps embarrassment at the product they're looking to procure. So there's very many different reasons. One of the things we're looking to do this year is to better understand the segmentation of that demand so that we can then target our communication messages that are really, really important part of the response to this accurately and press the buttons of the relevant segmented group to make sure that we affect their buying decisions. So it's many and varied is the short answer, but we are looking to understand that a bit more detail, what that looks like.
I think that's helpful. I should apologise to some people online for the drilling, which I hope might stop soon, but that may be distracting. Can I just, before others come in, can I just pick up the point Paul made about public health framing of this? I mean, I think I was reading the paper trying to ask myself what you see as the biggest public health threat here. I'm mindful of colleagues yesterday telling me about some of their concerns around weight loss drugs and use in women of childbearing age, for example. Is this something you could answer now, or is this something that you will be able to answer when you think about what the biggest threat to public health could be through this?
I think the biggest threat is the fact that these things is the online sale and the movement of people towards online purchasing of these medicines. So it's not necessarily product specific, although I can give you an answer to that as well. It's really the fact that it's now so heavily democratized, the availability of medicines online, both illegally and legally, that is the default step now for many people to access medicines, and many can access them quite legitimately. The challenge is recognizing the difference between a legitimate online supplier that we'd be content with and is adhering to the regulations, and an entirely illegal online supplier. Now, for the members of the public, that is a big challenge. And that, to me, is the biggest threat. In terms of the harm, commodity-wise, that's undoubtedly controlled drugs that are also medicines. That's the biggest harm to members of the public on a public health perspective.
Thank you. Claire and then Hader, I think.
Thank you, Andy. Really interesting paper, but what I felt was missing somewhat was the art of the possible with technology, and that might be because our teams work so closely together, so I know what's going on behind the scenes. And I won't wax lyrical today about artificial intelligence, for example, but I wondered, is that because you're trying to manage expectations around that, or maybe you're not confident in success and so on, or if there is a particular reason why that seems to be omitted?
Or maybe it's because I'm 58 years old and don't understand technology enough. No, it's a really good question, Claire, and one I've been asked several times, both by journalists and in presentations that I've given, and each time I've given a bad answer, so hopefully I'll try and improve that this time. It is missing, and at the moment we had a workshop recently to look at the implications for us of AI, particularly, which is something that obviously is the only game in town at the moment. understanding both how it could be used against us, how criminals may use it, and how that might change the dynamics of the threat, and also how we might use it as a tool against them. And we had a quite a lengthy workshop, and it was very good. And it was a huge learning curve for me and for my team. And because we're not natives to this, hands up to that. What we're now doing is understanding, now we understand how the technology may work and may develop over the years ahead or the months ahead even. We're now looking at use cases. What can we do, both criminal use cases and our own use cases? So that's the next step, Claire. And the short answer is I still don't really know what we're going to do with it, because there are things that it might help us to identify efficiencies, and we can release staff to do other things. I think that's something that could be done. And the thing that comes to mind is the industrial scale identification of illegally trading websites. I mentioned in my paper there are 30 to 40,000 of these things. There is a way. I don't know if AI is the tool or whether just some other sort of automated process is actually the tool, where you can identify and take action against those websites industrially, on industrial scale, and repeatedly, which is the best way of doing it. So I think that's the biggest tool that we can use. And I think at the other side of the coin, how can criminals use it against us? I think in the same way, they'll be able to industrially set up websites and get greater reach by using AI as a way of targeting particular groups. So I think that's the area, but there may be others. But we're working on it at the moment, Claire, with some help from your colleagues, I hasten to add, around the website checker tool that will enable people to identify illegally trading websites and make that distinction that I referenced earlier that is hard for them to do. So fair point, Claire.
And just to support that, so we talk about the AI use cases, we have about 20. And this is one of them, but we are managing expectations because it's early doors. So what my team are doing are prototyping, so to check proof of concepts and so on in different types of tools, because with AI, there is a spectrum. At that end, you would have, say, productivity, so doing things really quickly and freeing up staff time. Further along the spectrum, you do have decision support, decision making. We're more in the decision support. So we need to prototype those things so they're in a good state then for Andy's team to be able to really understand and decide whether they want to use those in earnest. And that's something actually that's been done within the MHRA, but also with other regulators and other organisations as well, outside of our own.
And do you have a sense from what you see and know of the technology where you think the early wins could be, without holding you to that? But
yeah, so definitely productivity, and so that's one of the easy ones anyway, almost a no-brainer if I use that phrase. So definitely search terms and summarising volumes and volumes of data, and on the scraping websites and so on, that would take humans however long. So that's we're pretty well on with that. That's quite established, that work. And then with the decision support work, so the example that you gave, how do we know when something's counterfeit and when something isn't? It's the teaching machine to help make those decisions. So it's the data that we give the machine and so on, and then the processes around that. So I think that's the thing that will come later that we're prototyping right now, and like I say, with other regulators and other organisations as well.
Right, thank you. I think
could I just come back to one button? Sorry to interrupt, but the one thing I didn't mention, which I think is really important and quite exciting, is that we've recently procured a new intelligence management system, as colleagues will know at the table. And we're working with the supplier of that on the next generation of that to understand how AI can be built into that intelligence system. And it's quite a scary prospect, as many of these things are, around the predictive work that can be done. So we take all our intelligence, which is significant. What can that tell us about the ability to predict criminality before it happens? Now that sort of brings to mind certain Hollywood movies where this was done. But it is, looking at the art of the possible, perhaps not in the short term, but we are taking active steps with our supplier to develop that capability within their IT system. That is the future of law enforcement, I think.
And there's a whole area of academic activity in that area, as I'm sure you know. So Janae, briefly, I think you wanted to come back, then Hader, and then I think maybe we'll wrap.
So I was just reflecting on the level of sophistication that bad actors could deploy now and in the future is significantly increasing. And we're probably not the only government department that's probably looking into this. How much work do we do across government to truly understand threats and concerns, and how much learning do we get from other agencies, perhaps looking at similar things, deep fake, misinformation, etc., that then can support us? Because we're not isolated in this. And I just wonder if we could leverage other resources to try and tackle some of our specific use cases.
Yeah, a really good question again. So we do work very closely, and we're not alone in this. All government are facing similar challenges, or law enforcement certainly. We have enjoyed a very close relationship with the National Cybersecurity Centre, who obviously lead the way in terms of this, and we've had some very successful operational results that I probably can't go into great detail in this forum, but certainly we work with the very sort of the most on point part of government from that perspective, from the technology side of it. We work closely with our border force colleagues too, to make sure that we are using what we can in terms of the detection side of technology. What can we do to detect consignments coming into the country illegally through the Home Office as well? And we're sort of linked into multiple cross-government forums to share best practice across law enforcement. It's kind of the way law enforcement has always worked, but it's taken a bit of a leap recently where we're all facing similar challenges, and the use of technology against us and the possibilities of technology for us is something that unites all law enforcement bodies. So yes, we do link in very closely with other agencies.
Okay, maybe last question, Hader.
By the question and the additions that Claire and Junaid were asking about, it is about relationship, and it's great to hear, Andy, really interesting paper, by the way. Great to hear of the strong relationships you have with other agencies and utilizing their forces. My question was more around the other tech companies, people like Meta, and how much engagement you're having with them. I think a lot of illegal drugs are being sold via online mechanisms. You talk about online being the new frontline, and I will be using that phrase as well. So that's, thank you for that. But yeah, just utilizing their power, and if we do something really interesting with AI, then perhaps we could hand that over to them and get them to put their might and compute power behind it. So I'm just wondering how relationship building with those kind of companies are going.
Yeah, another very good question. I'm delighted to say that we do enjoy strong levels of cooperation with the companies that you mentioned. They do have a challenge because obviously they have marketplaces and social media platforms and everything else. They are very willing to assist us, and sometimes assisting us in amending their algorithms to identify these things for us. And I think to me, it's all about leveraging them rather than building the thing ourselves and having a standing army ourselves. I did a similar thing. I worked in the past in child sexual abuse online, which was a very similar set of challenges, if you like, a similar set of stakeholders as well as the ones you mentioned. And it's just about us knocking on their door and asking them if they can do things for us, and them understanding the threat, because our understanding of the threat picture is the bit that quite often they miss. And it's incumbent on us to share that with them and dare to share, if you like, our understanding of the threat to help them to help us resolve it. And in the past, perhaps law enforcement have been reluctant to share anything with such companies. That's not the case any longer. I fully embrace that. And one of the things I want to do, perhaps this is perhaps for next year rather than this, is look at a kind of a hackathon where we bring those people in. I've used that successfully in previous crime types that I've dealt with. Bring these people in, present them with our problems, go away and think about it and come up with solutions. And I've been frequently amazed with how quickly and how strong some of these solutions can be, technological solutions. And how willing they are to do so. So I applaud the efforts of those companies.
Okay, we need to move on soon, but brief comment from Claire, then Alison, final word.
Yeah, I think it's just I take it for granted that everyone would know this, but just some assurance to you, Ginny. The default is for sure working with other organisations, whether it's regulators anyway, for the subject matter, but also in my space, in digital data and technology. So we have a hackathon actually with Swissmedic in 2 weeks, and that's on this is one of the use cases there that we've started to prototype already in our respective organisations and now coming together to join forces. So that happens all the time. We would never do something in isolation at MHRA. Someone's already thought of it. Sometimes we might think of it first, but the strength in numbers and all those other cliches.
Great, thanks. So maybe Alison, a final word.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to two issues. There's first of all the comms, and what an important part of communications it is in terms of reducing that demand. And as Andy said, segmenting the population, understanding those drivers and ensuring the public understand actually the threat and the risk that they're taking in accessing some of these sites. And the weight loss products, as Andy sets out in the paper, was a good example of that. But I just wondered, Andy, just before you leave, whether we could touch a little bit on the global environment. This is not just a UK problem, and Andy and his team work globally to try and manage some of these threats. And Andy, I don't know if you could just set out a little bit some of those interactions as well.
Yes, I mean, we are relatively unique in that we have a dedicated law enforcement function within the agency. I hesitate to say we are the only one in the world, but we're not far off it. So we enjoy that. And we are linked in with what generally happens is other regulators outsource this to their police service, their national police service. Invariably, we don't. So we link in even post EU exit. We link in with the European Union colleagues who are doing similar work, albeit not perhaps at the hard end, through the working group enforcement officers. And we have secured observer status for that group, which is a fantastic group. It enables us to, we probably give more than we get back, it's fair to say, but I think it's really important that we're thought leaders in this, because this is a global challenge. And if we can strengthen the response across the European Union, that's a positive thing for us as well. So that's a good thing too. We're linked in on a more global level. And we also linked in through Europol, of course. So that's something that the UK still enjoys access to, and we access that through the National Crime Agency. Interpol, we work closely with Interpol, and that's been an enduring relationship, and particularly around Operation Pangaea, which I think I mentioned in the paper as well, that we were the architects of 15 years ago. And in terms of cross-sector collaboration, we work with the PFIPC. Again, I think I mentioned that in the paper, that is sort of a global forum of cross-sector partners who come together with a single aim. So we are very much linked in, and we have bilateral relationships with individual countries, particularly India, which is extremely important to us. So a global solution to a global problem.
That's very helpful. Okay, look, well, thank you very much. Yeah, that is really interesting. I think that it'd be useful to know if you think there's anything particularly the board needs to take away and think about. I think it does feel to me like it would be useful to have a session for the board at some point on how we're using AI across the organization for the organization. And we might think about how we do that. This sounds like a good example of where that's having benefit. So thank you. And we look forward to seeing the progress. Great. I'm hoping for the next, there she is on cue. Laura. So Laura Squire's joining us online because she has an important meeting that you're attending on our behalf. So thank you, Laura. I think the next two items are with you. So can we hear you? Do you want to just say?
Yes,
perfect.
I hope so. And have we got Joseph Burt in the room as well? I'm hoping he's coming for both items.
I think he may just be outside the door. So, well, not immediately. Do you want me to fill time for you? Oh, here we go. On time. He's here. Welcome, Joseph. For those online, do you want to just introduce yourself? And Laura, perhaps if you introduce yourself as well, and then we'll take the first item.
So my name is Laura Squire. I'm one of the chief officers in the MHRA, and I'm currently leading on medtech regulatory reform.
And Joseph.
My name is.
So you just need to use the mic.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Burt. I'm the head of diagnostics with the MHRA.
And welcome back. So thank you. I don't know who's going to talk to the paper, but hopefully people have read it. So please start off and tell us what we
So I'll start. This is the first of two papers, which are focusing on different aspects of our medtech regulatory reform. The first one very much is a collaboration with Alison Cave's team. We couldn't have done it without them from a perspective of safety. And Joseph has a lot of the technical knowledge, so I'd like him in the room to do this, but I will present the paper on this one. the title of the paper was about how the new post-market surveillance regulations are going to improve patient safety whilst enabling access to access and innovation. It actually covers more than that, because improving patient safety requires pre-market and post-market measures. The paper explains that the changes are being made to the regulations over a series of statutory instruments, and the order of these was agreed by the board some time ago at the beginning of the programme, which in an order that prioritises patient safety. The first of these substantive SIs, the statutory instruments, is to be laid in Parliament very soon, and that puts in place new regulations for surveillance and vigilance after devices are already on the market. Post-market surveillance, as we call it, is internationally recognised as a vital part of medical device regulation, because it enables us to enables manufacturers to track how devices perform in the real world, and to feed that back into improvements in patient information, improvements in design, and also to detect safety problems early and take action. To an extent, these new rules level the playing field, as a lot of them are already in guidance. So what with having them in guidance, that allows it ensures that less responsible manufacturers, by putting them in law, have to comply with that. And it is also aligning us with international best practice. I would say that risk proportionality is built into these rules in two ways. One way is that the requirements are different for different risk classifications of medical devices, but the other is also that the timescales of reporting are different depending on the seriousness of the incident. If you look at paragraphs 3.6 onwards, that describes some additional pre-market measures which will be brought in the statutory instrument to follow the one for post-market surveillance. Examples of those, and they all link to the Cumberledge review, is the up classifications of implantable medical devices and software as a medical device, changes to IVD classifications, making them more risk-based, implant cards, ensuring that patients have the information they need to understand about the device that's been implanted into them, and UDI, unique device identifiers, to improve traceability. And then the last part of the paper describes how having a stronger post-market surveillance regime is an enabler of market access, because it's an enabler of international recognition. And we have today announced our framework for international recognition that we plan to put in place through the next statutory instrument. And it allows us to ensure that the MHRA is aware early of any safety concerns about any product on the UK market. So there are some questions for the board at the end of the paper. One is about whether they are assured that what we're doing here is providing improvements to patient safety. And the other is to invite your views, given that we have an opportunity to consult again on some aspects of the regulations, whether there are additional things that we should be thinking about. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Joseph. And I don't know if you want to comment further or.
Nothing to add for now.
Okay, great. So questions or comments for Laura and Joseph and Alison, I guess. Yeah, Mercy.
I just wanted to comment really that we've seen this at Patient Safety and Engagement Committee, and how important it is really and exciting really to see some of the recommendations from Cumberledge coming into force really through SIs. We need an adaptable system as well, but having things like kind of cards and things, so people actually can identify what's being given to them, and also the emphasis on what manufacturers need to do too. And so really want to kind of say how much we welcome this, and to see at last some developments, especially the changes in legislation that's going to lead to better patient safety in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I'd have said this 4 years ago, but I do find it exciting. So I think it's good. Yeah. Paul.
The implant cards are really important. Is there any way that they could be part of the summary care record? Because one of the common situations we face is an emergency MRI and somebody who may not be conscious, and so if they've got a card at home, it's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think so. I think the requirement to have the implant card will be brought in. I think one of the ways in the next statutory instrument, I think what we do need to do more work on is how that is integrated with the patient record, and potentially how that is enabled digitally as well. So I think there is more work to do on that. It's important to get the requirement in, but there's more work to do on how, and making sure that it does give that proper traceability. I agree.
I think Alison wants to come in on that.
Yeah, no, just to add that the unique device identifier will be a key tool, I think, in tracking who has what device, especially for implantables. And I suppose the ultimate ambition would be that that was a structured field within electronic health records, so you could identify which patient had which device.
Yeah.
Of course, that's
So-
a future ambition, but the inclusion of the unique device identifier within incident reports as part of this SI will start to move towards that.
So I know it's not the biggest issue, but I think could we push a bit on that? Because I wonder why it needs to take time. Because it feels to me like you have the potential to unlock a huge system of data here with the UDI, that if you mandated there was a field that had to be filled in each EPR, and we don't have that many, that would very quickly transform what might be possible. But I don't know if you have a sense.
I can only totally agree with you. If we had that available in the electronic health record for a patient,
It's a naive question. Can we mandate it?
Yes. I would need to take that away, obviously, to see if it can be mandated, but it's certainly something we're raising repeatedly where we have the opportunity to do so.
Claire, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, we might be slightly conflating two things, because summary care record, I mean, it's NHSE who own that and so on, and who look after the service and the database, but a flag can be put into the field. It doesn't necessarily have to be the device, which is the thing that takes longer, and to make it mandatory, the identifier for the device, but a flag to say there is something there is a little bit different and quicker solution. Yeah.
Potentially, I'd also come back in that one thing the NHS England are trying to implement and roll out now is scan for safety. And when those sort of measures where every device, every part of a surgical operation is scanned and understood, will actually move as a great way to being able to identify the source of potential adverse incidents related to medical devices. So there are a number of initiatives underway, but totally agree, Chair, that we need an urgency around it.
So, Mandy.
I would echo what you say. I mean, I was just thinking back to the Cumberland Review, and where UDIs were a key part of that, and it's taken us a long time to get there. So really understanding what those delays are would be good. But that wasn't my main question. But the other thing is, how much are we in line with the other sort of major regulators, the EU and the FDA, and what enforcement powers, having just heard Andy, does the MHRA have if manufacturers don't follow the rules and guidance?
Laura, do you want to take the second question? And then, yeah.
I mean, I can take them both, but also Alison may want to add on to them. We are aligning in this at the moment. We are behind the requirements in the EU, so we are aligning with that. The FDA requirements are different in the way that they're delivered. So part of their post-market delivered is part of their post-market rules are delivered through their quality management rules, and part of it is FDA specific for the higher classification of devices. But what I would say is that us, the EU and the FDA, we are all part of the IMDRF, and the IMDRF has some standards around post-market surveillance. So we're all committed to reaching those standards. That's what we're trying to do here. In terms of enforcement, Alison may want to pick that one up, but you can't enforce if you haven't got the information. This is about making sure that there is the information there at the moment. At the moment, we have quite a lot of products on the UK market which have been approved by European notified bodies, which are not under our control, and therefore the reporting requirements are to those European notified bodies. What we will do with this post-market surveillance rule is bring in requirements for reporting to the MHRA. So the start of enforcement has to be the information that we have that things are not working. So that's what I'd say about enforcement. And apologies, I've just seen a comment about what is the IMDRF. It's the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which brings together global regulators working towards harmonization of the rules.
Thank you. And my acronym reminder has also pointed out UDI, which is the Unique Device Identifier, and SI, which I think is the statutory instrument. I think, Alison.
Just a follow-on comment is that lack of compliance is not necessarily always criminal. It's just a manufacturer who's not following all of their requirements. And our predominant approach would be to work with the approved bodies and our compliance team to bring that manufacturer back into compliance with the regulations, which is normally successful. There is an indication of criminal activity. We would then start to take enforcement approaches. Thank you.
Can you give us some sort of feel for the sort of scale of all of this and just sort of number and sort of partly thinking about workforce plans again for the future? I think there were 1.5 million medical devices a couple of years ago, and how many are now UKCA marked, and how do we see that changing over the next couple of years as these instruments come into force?
So at the moment, our records have more than 1.5 million, but they are, I think there are on our device registration database, and Regulatory Connect will produce a more up-to-date and reliable registration database, which will include unique device identifiers, and I suspect 1.5 million is about the right number. Only a small proportion of those at the moment are UKCA marked, and that is I can see that continuing because the UK is a small percentage of the global market. We're about 2.7%. International recognition is going to be helpful in terms of maintaining supply for the UK, but we are beginning some work now to think about what does that mean for the UK CA mark itself, and how do we make sure that that remains something that people want to go for as an attractive first step. And I think there are two strands to that strategy. The UKCA mark, sorry, I'm just getting the acronym. That is the UKCA mark is the conformity assessment marking equivalent to the European CE marking, which we use to make sure that people know that a product is conforming with the regulations. So I think the two sides of that are about making sure that the UKCA mark is associated with routes to market that support innovators. So the Innovative Devices Access Pathway is really important part of that, to encourage people to come to the UK first to get their regulatory approval. And I think the other thing that working with the International Medical Device Regulators Forum to make sure that internationally what is happening in the UK for our regulations is understood globally, so that other countries, and there are many of them that are now doing international recognition, will look at the UK as a possible place that they could also recognise. So I think there are two things there to sort of build up the UKCA mark as it is, but at the moment the vast majority are CE marked products.
Although I would assume that the Innovative Devices Pathway is a pretty small percentage of what might be going through. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, there are only 8 products on that. So that's at a pilot phase, and that's the start. But the principle of that is that if we can join up better with the system, then that's one way in which we could think about the UKCA mark being more attractive. And post-market surveillance, that having post-market surveillance that allows us to know exactly what is happening with all products on the market really help with that.
Right. Any other comment or questions? No? Okay. Well, I mean, I think, thank you for the paper. I think it is very positive, and I think you've heard a lot of very positive things about it. I think I would encourage you to think about how we want those numbers to be used and what we can do to make sure that happens. The sort of example that Paul is using, it, how do we make sure that it could be used in a summary record, for example?
Yeah.
I think that would be key to get the maximum out of this, but it seems like very positive steps forward. Great, thank you. Sort of draw a verbal line and we'll move to the next paper, if that's all right. Back to you.
Yeah, so this is, as I say, this is another aspect of our regulatory reform for medical devices that we're undergoing at the moment. Diagnostics are playing an increasingly important role in patient management, early detection of disease, and enabling preventative health measures. In vitro diagnostics come within the UK medical device regulations, which currently going back to 2002. And this paper, like the last one, focuses on an aspect of our medtech regulatory reform program, this time in vitro diagnostics, or IVDs, including those including those incorporating artificial intelligence, or AI. So I'm delighted to introduce Joseph Burt, who heads up our in vitro diagnostics team, and he is going to say a few things about the paper.
Over to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to the board. Thank you, Laura. May I highlight the 4 topical challenges for IVDs presently? You have read potentially in this paper, the current UK regulations are not kept up to pace with the advancements of diagnostics technologies. The incorporation of artificial intelligence, or AI, presents additional regulatory challenges. We are overcoming these challenges by the introduction of the future UK medical devices regulations, and that builds proportionate regulatory controls on current regulations. Our approach recognizes the IVDs are intended to replace, not to replace, the healthcare professional in providing a clinical diagnosis, but rather to augment the capabilities and expertise supported by such novel technologies and artificial intelligence. The second challenge you may have read in this paper is the increasing use of centralized laboratory testing capabilities in a global context. This is where patient samples that are taken from the United Kingdom are centrally tested in industrialized or specialized laboratories. In the US, they're called lab-developed tests. In Britain, we call them in-house manufactured testing. In the US, the FDA's work on lab-developed tests culminated on the 29th of April this year. They announced that there is a final rule associated with lab-developed tests aimed at helping to ensure that safety and effectiveness of the laboratory-developed tests are paramount. We welcome this announcement, and it brings greater alignment internationally with the approaches of lab-developed tests, more closely aligned with the previous approach that we have here in the UK and in Europe, and ensuring controls over tests are developed and used in-house. We're also engaging with trusted advisor groups on how centralized testing could facilitate virtual wards and hospitals at home programs that are currently in place. The next challenge you may have read in this paper is one of education. Education and the importance of human factors in the design of in vitro diagnostic devices. Digitization has brought sophistication and unconscious reliance on the in vitro diagnostic device to think like a human. The attractiveness of the notion of removing the human in the loop to meet efficiency challenges must be balanced against an understanding of the addition of a digital element to a diagnostic device that brings it additional regulatory requirements to protect patients and the public versus ensuring any efficiency gains are real. So the MHRA will meet this challenge by continuing to work with the healthcare system to provide the breadth and depth of understanding of how additional digital elements can impact the regulatory requirements of diagnostic devices. Healthcare professionals are critical to ensure regulatory compliance and safe use of IVDs is met. The fourth and final challenge you may have read in this paper is the need for independent verification testing of high-risk in vitro diagnostic devices. Provisions for this requirement is becoming limited in the United Kingdom. There's a need to develop capacity in the UK to ensure reliance and to future-proof any demand spikes that we have in the future. We intend to explore what a substantial and reliant UK solution could be. And finally, in this paper, international collaboration engagement presents opportunities to resolve many of our global shared challenges in IVDs. For example, the IVD working group was supported by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, as a new working group that's been re-established to work on clinical evidence requirements, harmonization of IVDs. Similarly, the UK, on that particular topic, the UK and the European Commission are working together on that particular working group. Another example is regulatory alignment on pandemic preparedness, and specifically on regulatory arrangements ahead of the next pandemic as part of our 100 days mission. The MHRA is taking actions to address these 4 challenges that you may have read in this paper. And we're working with partners domestically in the UK and internationally. So thank you for considering these actions, and I invite the board to support these actions. I pass back to the chair.
Thank you both. Open the paper for comments or questions. Mercy.
Just obviously the use of AI and the use of labs that are kind of based in other countries and things. I'm always a little bit worried about machine learning and AI developed on different populations, and if they're going to reflect the UK population, especially when it comes to the makeup of ethnic minorities and others that might not, you know, kind of regularly be kind of, so developing AI based on populations. How are we going to make sure that it's relevant and it's going to kind of pick up the right kind of things for our population?
Chair, shall I answer?
Please, yeah.
So that's a really excellent question. Thank you. So the importance of different populational demographics is fundamental to how the performance of the device works. Very much so, especially in genetics. Our genetic makeup is very different around the world. So what we want to ensure, as even in machine learning and AI, but in other performance, is the inclusion of the demographics that population needs, that device needs to be used for in the population. So in there, we have something called conformity assessments and essential requirements. So this is where we start to include some of those requirements into demographics and populational use. And so it comes to the intended use of that device, and that intended use of the device is for that population. Thank you.
Okay. Sinead?
So really thorough, and maybe something to think about. And Laura, this might link into some of the conversations that you and I have had with Paul. There are emerging frameworks, such as responsible AI frameworks, that we may wish to consider to go a bit deeper into Mercy's approach when we think about how these models are both developed, deployed, the impact on the end user and otherwise. And fairness and inclusion is a key category within kind of this notion of responsible AI, and happy to share some additional information with you around that as a potential framework that you may wish to evolve and develop over time.
Sounds like that would be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mercy. June.
Can I ask about the recent US announcement about the laboratory aspect? Does that change in any way our roadmap, or does it, if you like, strengthen it? And the second area I think we should perhaps note more is our policy position on wellness. It's a burgeoning area. People are buying glucose monitors and all sorts. That policy perhaps hasn't been kicked around too much. We've received it and noted it. Do you think, and perhaps it's for Laura to advise on, we should, if you like, exhibit our proposals and make sure that we have a wide alignment on them? Thank you.
I think, thank you. Yeah, on the first one of those, I think the US announcement is really, really welcome, because I think the way in which lab developed tests, in-house exemptions, all of those things have worked around the world. The industry has moved forward beyond that, and the way in which these tests are undertaken has moved beyond that. And the fact that the US is now taking control of that is actually quite helpful, because that was the direction we wanted to go in as well. So it's useful from a point of view of the world being aligned. It's also useful from a perspective of a lot of those test results will end up back in the UK, and therefore it's reassuring for us to know that they are putting in additional controls there. I think on the
Laura, before you come to wellness, can I just ask, I mean, is there any expectation as to whether the use of those labs is likely to change as a result of the FDA changing their regulations? I mean, are they likely to become more or less attractive?
Joseph might want to come in on that.
Yes, Chair. The attractiveness of centralization is always there. It's always there. There's many aspects of benefits that can be done. So the more and more in use of these centralized testing facilities, be it in the United States, in Switzerland, or other locations, is going to be much more increasing.
Okay. I was just curious as to whether it might increase costs and decrease competitivity. Anyway, sorry, Laura, you were going to talk about wellness.
Yes, I think this is a wider question around the sort of borderline of what is a medical device and what is not a medical device, which is increasingly it's around diagnostics and IVDs where the tests that take place, which are a bit predictive, and whether they go as far as informing clinical decision making. But it's also a big area in terms of apps and software only products as well. So I think it would be helpful to have a bigger conversation about this, because there are pros and cons of going in both directions. What I wouldn't want to do is to put the borderline at a place. I mean, at the moment the law looks quite clear and what a medical purpose is, but there is an awful lot at the borderline. And I think going one way or another, what we don't want to do is to end up regulating everything and then not focusing the efforts on the highest risk device. But at the same time, people using these products, some of this is about awareness of what the public knowing what they're using, whether it's a regulated medical device or whether it's a toy or an app. And there are discussions ongoing with the app stores and organizations that sell these medical devices around trying to segregate those in terms of the marketing, because I think that's some of the start about this, that the consumer is actually aware of what they're picking up. So yes, there is more work to do on that, and I think it would be a really useful conversation to have.
And can I just sort of just get a sense of where we think we should be doing that conversation and what's missing at the moment?
So I think we can. I mean, we can pull something together of where I think we probably need to set out where the global position is, which is also changing. Because certainly in the US there are some wellness apps that have gone through the FDA, not because the FDA has asked for them, but because the company has chosen to do it that way. So that it's sort of become by default that they've gone in as a medical device, and a lot of it turns on that Joseph mentioned earlier, the statement of intended purpose. And we need to, one of the issues is what we don't want to do is discourage people from properly describing their statement of intended purpose, because they don't want to step over into the definition of medical device. And that comes down to lots of conversations we are already having across systems to make sure that people like the NHS who are buying things understand what they should be looking at in a statement of intended purpose, and make sure they're using the product in a way that matches what the statement of intended purpose is. Because if they're using it more broadly than that, then it hasn't been properly regulated. So there are a lot of issues around this to explore. It's probably not a quick conversation that we can have today, but we can certainly pull something together on that. And I think it is something that we're talking to the MedTech strategy program board about, because it's a system join up issue as well, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So we can revisit the question of that. Glenn and then Paul and then sorry, Mandy.
Just to pick up the point about wellness and what's our policy, and just an offer to work with Laura and her team. I think there are parallels with pharmacy first reclassification on medicines and the work being done there. I think if we can bring that two together, we can probably start to formulate what a overarching policy would look like. So just an offer to do that along with Laura.
Great.
Thank you.
And I think, Laura, you sort of said this already, and it sort of doesn't require a big conversation. And it sort of just shows how critical it is to have the data on how things are used in the real world. Because thinking back to the example from decades ago now, where stents were introduced as biliary stents, but people knowing fine well they were going to be used as coronary stents. But it was a sort of a regulatory sort of easier route to take.
Yes, yeah, and the focus on intended purpose is really important for that, because you can't just take something from one place and use it somewhere else because it hasn't been tested. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Mandy.
Yeah, and I think it's building on those points really. And I think, Joseph, you said it in your challenge 3, education is a massive part of this and its success, both for healthcare professionals, for manufacturers and for patients. And just how have we considered our role in education in that broader population? Because otherwise we could be ending up, as Andy was saying, we've got medical devices doing harm because they're, or IVDs doing harm.
So that's
in the same way.
That's a live discussion at the moment, Andy. So I'm glad you've raised it, because I think this is something that we're seeing a lot. As we have a real window of opportunity now between now and the new pre-market regulations coming into force next year, to work with the NHS and with the procurement teams, I think, as well as with clinicians, to make sure that there is an understanding of regulatory compliance, and that is something that I think is a medtech. There is the cross-system medtech strategy, which has now just passed its first year. We are part of that program board, and that is where discussions have been happening about the need for greater education. So I'm actually working with NICE and the NHS and DHSC to pull something together for a discussion at that forum about education. I think we have certainly a part to play in it.
Joseph, did you want to come in?
Education is fundamental for the use of diagnostic products. There are the complexity, as we have seen through the pandemic, can be as simple as a lateral flow strip test, which you have an instruction for, to much more complex laboratory-based instrumentation and the incorporation of other software and elements. So the education of digital elements, as well as artificial intelligence, as well as other knowledge about the device, is so fundamental for the use of that device.
Great. Maybe before we finish, could I just pick up a different point that you put in challenge 4, which was about the UK capacity for batch testing. And you stopped short of recommending anything. So is this something you think the MHRA should be taking a more active role in, or is this something we should be encouraging others to do? What's the view here?
I would say both, Chair. I think there is, I think we talked about resilience in this discussion, and at the moment there isn't much resilience in the European system. I think there are 2 labs that are doing this, one predominantly working for the WHO. So I think there is a lack of resilience in the geographical locality. So there is certainly expertise within the MHRA to do this sort of thing. So that would be one aspect of it. But I think it is also about designing something that does not have a single point of failure. So I would answer both of those things are the solutions that we're looking at. We've just said that we will establish a trusted advisor group to look at this issue, which I think is really important, because I think there are possibly several solutions that could run in parallel to give the system resilience that we need. So we're not at the stage of recommending anything to you yet.
All right. Well, I won't. We'll ask Nicola in due course what her thoughts are, but maybe not now. But I think it's a slightly separate issue. But I was certainly struck during the pandemic about the lack of central testing capacity in this country, which is not the same as batch testing, I know, but it could be relevant. All right. Final comment, June. Do you want to?
No, I think that Mandy wants to.
Mandy. Okay. No. All right. No, I think that's really helpful. We've had a useful discussion, and I think there's lots of positive things there. And thank you for that. But we've got some clear messages about wellness and wanting to revisit that, and particularly around the communications and education that's going to be required, that we might want to hear more about in due course. So thank you. And then we move on to Mercy, who's going to update us about the most recent patient safety engagement committee.
That's right, Patient Safety Engagement Committee, which we met on the 9th of May. There were two areas that we really had, I think, really good discussions on. One was the evaluation of the patient involvement strategy, and the other was the electronic patient information leaflet. So the evaluation of the patient involvement strategy was really, it's I was going to say, partway through the strategy, which actually covers 2021 to 2025. And it was really looking at not just how we're doing, but really how we can improve the strategy, especially going into the next phase of it. And I think it will, the evaluation with some recommendations will be coming to the board anyway. But this was our chance to really look at what was found during that evaluation. So three things I want to kind of obviously highlight from that. So some of the findings was, yes, we are getting to patients in many different ways. So we obviously have a patient involvement forum. We also work with specific patient groups. For instance, Sickle Cell Society helped us very specifically over particular drugs and things. And so very much we kind of, the MHRA tends to kind of lead it in like what staff want to do, they tend to do, and then reach out to patients. And I think there's something about how can we involve patients in a more proactive way and more around decision making instead of us then going to them on very specific drugs and things. So that was, I think, one of the learnings from our kind of discussions. Also, how difficult it was sometimes to get back to patients, especially when we haven't actually requested that we get back to them in different ways and for different subjects. So there's a learning curve for us, I think, about seeking permission to get back to people, not just on things that they might have raised with us, but on other areas that we might want to actually get back to them and consult them on. So I think there's something that we kind of learned from that as well, to be proactive. I'm not going to comment too much on it. I think we had a really interesting discussion. One of the key points about our transparency and how we engage with patients and how we get back to them is through our website. And I think we all agreed there was improvements to be made, and something maybe again the board need to discuss about how we use our kind of website. The other area which potentially could be really exciting is the electronic patient information leaflet. And there is a group that's working on this, manufacturer-led, but with a very close involvement of the MHRA. And there is going to be a pilot look at looking at kind of a digital patient information leaflet. I think the committee were more interested in how the patient information leaflet could be actually developed for the future. For instance, using things like videos and other ways of trying to explain patient, you know, kind of the patient information and specific characteristics and the risks involved in medicines in a much more interactive way. So using QR codes, you know, kind of videos and other ways. We did talk about digital exclusion, but we also concluded that actually many people don't, even the printed version, people don't really read the patient information leaflet. We talked about Braille versions and other things that are available, but we also acknowledged that for many people, especially those who were challenged by the patient information leaflet, and anecdotally, I think that's quite a number of us really that we don't read it, but potentially there could be a way of communicating what's on those leaflets in a much more interactive way. So we realise that the pilot that's going through at the moment is very limited in that it's just a digital translation of what's there already, but the potential later to have much more interactive and better information for patients is actually what the committee was kind of more interested in. But those were kind of our main topics. that we covered. And I think that is also coming back to the board, because really, if we want that future, if we want that interactive patient information leaflet, we'll have to have a business case, we'll have to cost it, we'll have to sort of think, how would we keep centralized information, which is a key part of how we can then digitize and use more interactive ways of kind of giving over information to the public. And that all has a cost. So it will come back to the board.
Yeah, I think that would be very welcome. Thank you for such a comprehensive summary. And I guess also, you know, that information leaflet's an opportunity to raise the awareness of the yellow card scheme and so forth as well. And before questions, sorry, just I was just going to ask Rachel to comment on the website question. So I think this did come up, and I think this was felt to be a big barrier in terms of communication with the public in particular, and that some agencies actually seem to be able to operate in a different way. So Rachel, I just wonder if you comment on how we might try and address that.
Yes, certainly. And some colleagues will remember that we did make a very strong case for keeping our own website rather than moving on to the gov.uk platform some years ago. But we were at that point, we were only successful in gaining exemptions for service and product websites, not for our main corporate patient facing one. But I think it's a good time to review where we are. And to me, there's 2 points. One is, what insight do we have that can support both improvements on the site we have, but potentially us doing something different? And then secondly, what might our ambitions be? And is it about doing more with what we have or doing something different? So we'd like to bring that back to the board for a discussion, potentially in July, so that we can embrace the feedback from Patient Safety and Engagement Committee and then take that forward.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think it would be helpful if it comes back to know what you'd like to really push for.
Yes,
and then
yes,
sort of-
absolutely.
Claire.
Digitisation, so happy to help with that, and understanding user behaviours as well, because it's different with paper and digital and so on. So we can have an offline about that, and same, Rachel, with the website as well. There'll be quick improvements and so on that we can make, and as part of that overall piece that we're looking at back at the ranch as well.
Okay, that's a helpful offer. So Paul.
It's sort of really encouraging and exciting, the developments. Has there been any thinking about the consent process for a patient taking a medication? Because a lot of the communication in terms of risk is discussed or should be discussed at that point in time, and a good clinician making sure that there's not sort of too much of a nocebo effect when they do read if they do read the information leaflet.
Well, we didn't discuss it, but decision-making kind of ways has been done by other organisations as well. So that kind of supporting people. I don't know if Alison, you wanted to comment on that.
So that sort of consent process is definitely rests with the healthcare professional, but we would of course want to support them as much as possible in provision of materials which aid those discussions in a sort of a user-friendly way. So we are really excited by the prospects and the potential that electronic product information can give us. We know patients feel daunted by the product information leaflet. It's quite hard to navigate, but it is our main tool at the moment for providing information. But with the advent of electronic product information, we have options about searchable patient information leaflets, new ways to present information, videos, potentially graphics, colour, all sorts of options to highlight specific issues. But, you know, obviously it's complex and we need to work out how we could manage that.
Is that what you had in mind, or was it more about the actual consent process?
Well, I mean, for example, with Valparate, where we are have introduced a directed consent process, and this is what is expected as a minimum in the conversation you have with the patient. And so as clinicians, there's good and not so good practice probably will be a range, and just what are the things that we can do to support that. And there's sort of quite a lot of research on consent in other areas.
So I think we've kind of touched, but important that we can come back to that. Yeah, other questions for Mercy on the paper? Glenn, is that a... Don't go to any auctions. You'll buy something accidentally.
Yes, I'll get get it right. No, just a comment on the website, and I think I can follow the logic as to why the agency will be on gov.uk, and I don't think we need to dispute that. But this electronic information and the way you want to present it feels much more like a public service and a public health service than it does a core agency function. So perhaps we can work with colleagues in the department to explore that avenue rather than the bigger fight, which is.
Rachel, it sounds like you've got a whole team assembling as we speak, so this is good. Hader, last question, and then we'll move on.
See any mention of the NHS app in as a potential vehicle?
We did talk about it.
Yeah.
I think we talked about it, didn't we?
We did.
Why talk about it everywhere?
But I meant to mention it in the context of UDI, but I think, yes, it always needs to be part of the conversation, doesn't it?
Yeah, and once we have an electronic patient information, there's all sorts of ways that we can interact, including, I think I was going to comment on Paul's issue as well. It's kind of opening up that interactive use of information for patients that's really, really important, and then linking across the whole system. So I see the potential, definitely.
Okay, thank you. I think in that case, thank you for that paper. It's very comprehensive. Do you want to comment? No. In that case, over to you, Michael, for your summary.
Yeah, very quickly, the audit committee met on the 24th of April. Just to highlight 3 points. On the 9th of July, this board will meet to approve the financial statements and annual report that June as accounting officer has to sign, and then we are required by statute to ensure that these documents are laid before the House goes for its summer recess. So the committee, when we met in April, was very much focused on the agency's preparedness for ensuring that we meet that timetable, and also to ensure that external audit were in a position to deliver their work to provide an audit opinion. At this point in time, Rose and I were just joking, inevitably some things always happen, but at the moment we are confident that that timetable will be met so that the board is in a position to meet its statutory responsibilities on the 9th of July. The second point I would highlight, and this is really to congratulate the agency. We looked at a series of internal audit reports, and the report on risk and the way in which the agency has put in place systems and processes to manage risk received substantive assurance from internal audit, which is really, really good. You're always asking for more, and the key thing now is to ensure that risk management is embedded in all the decisions that the agency makes, and that we've got the appropriate balance between managing risk, but not at the extent to which we don't realise opportunities to promote innovation that ultimately benefit patients. But that is a really good news story, and I extend my thanks to Paris and all those people that have been involved in that. And then the final point I'd make is that every year, June, as accounting officer, has to report on her view on the control environment that operates within the agency. Now, the main substantive piece of evidence for that assurance comes from the work of internal audit. Over the last couple of years, the last 2 years, and you will know that internal audit issued a limited opinion. The good news is this year, the internal audit reports, much more have been in the moderate space rather than limited, which is again a good improvement. So on the pure arithmetic, if you add them all up, we should get to we should get the limited removed, but it's not as simple as that, largely because internal audit have to take a more holistic assessment looking at the performance of the agency over the whole year. And so they do have to take into account that we have been faced with some performance challenges. I know the agency have been making very strong representations to internal audit and presenting a range of evidence to demonstrate that we are on the upward hills of making improvement. So it's really over to internal audit. My understanding at the moment is that their opinion is being reviewed by their internal quality assessors, and they will get back to the agency shortly. The important point I would make is regardless of wherever this lands, I think a lot of very good work has been done over the last 6 months to move the organisation forward, particularly in around the return to green. I think the question mark the internal audit would have is, would they be confident that this is bringing sufficient resilience within the organisation, that this is a forward trajectory and not something that's going to result ultimately in 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. So we'll see where we land on that. But Chair, those are my 3 points. Thank you.
That's very helpful, Michael. So sorry, in terms of the internal audit report is due roughly, when do we get that? Before next board or? Sorry, just microphone.
Apologies. It will come to the audit committee at its next meeting, I think in early July, and then it'll be incorporated into June's governance statement
So
and
maybe
report. So
until
that will
summer.
be very visible to the board.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like lots of reasons to be positive. Any questions or comments for Michael on that process, recognizing that still there's work to do? If not, we'll just take that as a record of the meeting and thank you and the committee for the work that you've been doing. So thank you. So that concludes the papers that we have this morning. I think we have a number of people online who've had the opportunity to submit questions. So I'll hand over to you, Rachel, to tell us what we have.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we've had some pre-submitted questions as usual. There's one that we'll take today because that relates to the Chief Exec's report, and the others will receive written answers after the meeting. So if we start with an item that came up in June's report, and it relates to the clozapine safety review. So the questioner is asking, what are the terms of reference of the clozapine safety review and when will they be published on the website? And then the second part to the question, have we had any indication of the number of deaths associated with clozapine from drug companies? And if not, when do you anticipate you'll have that information?
So I think, Alison, can you answer that?
Yes, of course. So thank you for the question. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank families of patients either currently on clozapine or who have suffered harm while on clozapine, who shared their stories with us. It has provided us with huge insights in some of the issues surrounding the use of clozapine, and which we do understand for some patients is a uniquely effective drug, but also it needs very careful monitoring. So through these discussions, we have identified there are a number of parallel work streams, and this will be a complex review. And we anticipate that this will include consideration of the hematological monitoring requirements, which are part of the current safety requirements for clozapine and whether changes will be required, evaluation of reports with a fatal outcome, which the questioner has raised, and the reporting requirements associated with the company monitoring scheme. And I can confirm that we have recently requested and received reports of all deaths notified through the patient monitoring services, and we are assessing these alongside our own review of the yellow card. And lastly, improving the awareness of risks associated with clozapine for patients and their families. So we've begun work scoping this out, including where we need additional data generation, for example, bespoke studies. And the timelines are a bit uncertain and changeable as the data emerges, but we do intend to communicate the initiation of the reviews through our website. I would also just like to note that we plan alongside this to initiate a project involving patients and other stakeholders to establish the current awareness of risks associated with clozapine, but also to consider the type and format of the information which is needed, very much touching on our previous discussion about electronic product information and about how we raise awareness of these. And so this, in conjunction with Rachel's team, we're intending to launch later this year, and there will be a formal announcement. So at this time, unfortunately, I can't give the inquiry definitive timelines for the review, but I would like to reassure them that we absolutely recognise the importance and that the work is underway and will be communicated shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on that, but hopefully that will address to some extent the question. Rachel, other questions that you have?
Thank you. The second question relates to the performance report, and it's about statutory timescales for review of clinical trial applications. So the questioner is saying until 2022, the initial reviews of phase 1 healthy volunteer trials were done in an average of 14 days. Are you committed to expedited review of those trials to ensure that UK phase 1 research remains competitive? That may be a question for Mick, I think.
Yeah, thanks. So the priority is to be within statutory timeframes for all clinical trials, which is 30 days. There is a commitment, and the clinical trials team working very closely with the research community to look at how they can prioritise those trials. The new CT regs will go some way to making the system more risk proportionate.
It's not quite an acronym, Mick, but you might go to CT regs.
Clinical trials regulations, sorry. Bringing more risk proportionality notifications of certain clinical trials, which frees up resource and will further improve our performance. I was asked also to note that ethics approval is also required, which often goes beyond 14 days as well.
If I understood the question, it's whether there's differentiation within the statutory limits for phase 1 trials, and I don't know. I don't think there's an intention to do that at the moment, unless I'm wrong.
No, but there was a commitment to have the approvals around 14 days, which was kind of half the statutory timeline, and we're not there. We would like to get there, but our focus needs to be on the 30-day performance and use the new regulations to free up time to further improve that performance.
Okay. Any further comment on that? I know that not everyone's here, so okay.
Yeah, there's no further questions.
Great. Well, thank you. So that concludes the questions for today. And I'd remind people online that if the questions are not related to the board agenda today, then please to contact the Customer Experience Centre directly for a response. So thank you to all of our staff in the agency who've contributed and continue to contribute to the production of these papers and all the ongoing work behind them, and for supporting the meeting. And finally, before we leave, I'd just like to remind everybody that the purpose of the MHRA is to protect and improve public health. And we continue to do that through enabling scientific innovation, accelerating patient access to new products, and by strengthening our patient safety and surveillance systems. So with that in mind, we'll close the meeting, and thank you all for your time.